going, we'll jump in. All right, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. I'm Allison Atkins. I'm the Assistant Director at the Kennebunk Free Library. We are so grateful for the Camden Conference and for Laura Henry for making this happen tonight. It sounds like such a fascinating program and we're delighted to be part of it. I'm going to introduce you to V. Sheehan, who's part of the Camden Conference, and she's going to tell you a little bit about the conference itself.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We're delighted that you can be with us. As you probably know, these community events, talks, and libraries are leading up to the Camden Conference, which is a weekend conference this year on the geopolitics of the Arctic, a region in peril, which is our 34th annual conference. Tickets for this live streamed event are on sale through our website, camdenconference.org, where you will also find our terrific roster of presenters, beginning with our keynote speaker, Olafur Grimsson, former president of Iceland. Also on the website are other interesting events and talks leading up to the Camden Conference. So I look forward to hearing Laura Henry's talk tonight and hope to see some of you virtually on February 20th. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I guess I'll take it from here. Hello, everybody. My name is Laura Henry. I'm a professor in the Department of Government and Legal Studies at Bowdoin College. And I wanted to thank both Allison and V for inviting me this evening. We really are so lucky in Maine to have the Camden Conference and to have such a vibrant system of libraries. And I'm really happy to be part of the broader event in some small way. As you know, I'm here tonight to talk to you about indigenous communities and oil companies in the Russian Arctic, and I'm going to share my screen so we can see my PowerPoint presentation. And we'll get started. I would love to tell you tonight about some research that I've been doing over about the past 8 years in Russia. And I'm gonna try not to go too deep into the weeds. We all know that professors, once they get started talking, they can drone on and on. So I'm gonna try to keep it pretty relatively short so that we can come together with a bunch of questions and a broader conversation toward the end of the evening. But the way I became involved in this research is that for years I've been studying the Russian environmental movement, really since the early 1990s. And I was doing a lot of work on forestry, I was doing a lot of work on climate change, but I had never been to the Russian Arctic. And then during the summer of 2012, I had the opportunity to start a brand new research project in the Russian Arctic, which was looking at how local communities interact with the oil companies that are rapidly developing the region to extract hydrocarbons, not only for Russia, but also, of course, for the global market. So the first thing I want to do is I want to acknowledge my two co-authors, Maria Tisachnuk, who's here at the top, and Svetlana Tulaeva at the bottom. So many of us who are scholars in North America benefit from collaboration with scholars in other Arctic countries. And I just want to say that's been my experience. We designed this fieldwork together. We carried out all of the initial fieldwork together, and they go back every summer, and I'm able to go back part of the time. So that's really been a really great thing. Okay, so let's get started and talk about the indigenous peoples of the Russian Arctic. So Russia has more than 160 groups of peoples who could be considered indigenous. And 40 different groups are recognized as the indigenous minority peoples of the North, Siberia, and the Far East. And so those are the groups that we're going to talk about today. If we exclude the subarctic, we can see that there are about 80 to 90,000 indigenous people living in the Russian Arctic, and they're from a whole host of different groups. The Nenets, the Chukchi, the Khanty, the Evenk, the Selkuk, the Sami, and that's just to name a few. Now, during the Soviet period, as Soviet power under the Communist Party sort of penetrated into the periphery and the provinces, There was a great effort to try to encourage indigenous peoples of the Arctic to cease their nomadic way of life and to actually settle down, and ideally to settle down into collective farms, because the Soviets thought that collective farms were a good way not only to resolve issues of poverty, to deliver social services, but also that they had a positive effect on sort of individual members of the proletariat, introducing them to regular meaningful work, kind of incorporating them into this great project of Soviet power. Now, what this meant was that there was a huge disruption to traditional ways of life in the Arctic during the Soviet period. So many people who had engaged in reindeer herding or fishing or trapping or hunting, they still engaged in those activities, but often within the context of a state-run collective farm. Also, they were encouraged to give up their traditional religious practices. Now, this wasn't because, the Soviets were trying to spread Orthodox Christianity, but it was because, of course, the Soviet regime was officially an atheist regime. They were also encouraged to send their children to boarding schools where the children could learn to speak Russian, to be Russified. So this is very reminiscent to things that happened in Canada, things that happened with Native Americans in the US, things that happened with Aboriginal people in Australia and New Zealand. Now, there were great benefits to Soviet power as well. And one of the benefits was the Soviets saw themselves as modernizing these communities. They were going to come in with electrification. They were going to deliver the fuel, the heating oil, the firewood that was necessary for these new settled communities. They were going to create transportation links by plane, by helicopter, sometimes by road. They were going to provide basic medical care through clinics. So there was this kind of give and take of the Soviet era, right? Where many things were lost, but some things were gained. Now, in 1991, as I think this audience, my students actually have to remind them what happened in 1991 because it's ancient history to them, but I feel like this audience actually will remember that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And that led to another period of enormous disruption in the region, where suddenly all of those state subsidies that had provided the basic healthcare, the transportation, the fuel, the electricity, they basically collapsed. Sometimes by design, the state withdrew, but often the state just couldn't contribute to those services. And people were left to fend for themselves. And so throughout this period, some nomadic reindeer herding persisted, and we saw many people return to it in the post-Soviet era. Now, as many of you know, there is a huge overlap between areas of indigenous settlement and areas where there are significant oil and gas reserves, right? So these are often remote areas. We see this up by the Barents Sea, the Timan-Pechora area here, my cursor, Eastern Siberia, Sakhalin, right? And so beginning with exploration in the 1970s, but then really taking off in the late 1990s, we saw the enormous growth of the oil and gas industry in Russia. And it is in fact the growth of this industry that would fuel Russia's post-Soviet economic recovery and fuel the regime that exists in Russia today. But of course, extracting hydrocarbons is a messy business, and the tundra is a very delicate ecosystem. And so we see damage in the Arctic ranging from oil spills, water contamination, the destruction of kind of plants and lichen that are food for reindeer. We see gas flaring, waste, all different kinds of disruption. And in many cases, it's indigenous communities that feel this disruption most keenly, either because it's quite proximate to where they live, or because it's on the traditional territory where they engage in fishing, hunting, or reindeer herding. And we see that this oil and gas extraction is increasing rapidly, even in the midst of climate change, and partly because of climate change. As we'll see from the Camden conference, it's the actual receding of the ice that makes it possible in many cases to explore the region for oil and gas. It creates problems as well. The thawing of the permafrost creates tremendous problems with infrastructure. But here we see 2015, 16, 17, 18. I don't know if you can see 19, it might be under the photos, but we see an increase every year of all of these different companies in the Russian Arctic. Big Russian companies like Gazprom, Rosneft, Lukoil, but also countries from the West. British Petroleum, ConocoPhillips, Equinor, which is the big Norwegian-owned oil giant. Okay. All right, so what can Indigenous peoples do, right? They find themselves again sort of suffering the brunt of a kind of political and economic reorganization in their territory. Now, many of us are aware that according to global conventions and international agreements, Indigenous peoples have rights. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the most famous agreement that acknowledges that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination and to self-governance, in addition to which, this quote here indicates that Indigenous people should control the developments affecting them and their lands, territories, resources that will enable them to maintain and strengthen their institutions, cultures, and traditions, right? So this is the ideal. This is what's codified in global law. There are some challenges. One, the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights is a global convention that states can sign on to, but then they are in charge of implementing it, right? There is no global body that oversees that implementation. And another problem is that Russia abstained from the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights and never signed. So that means that this principle, which is known as free, prior, and informed consent, which is a guiding principle for how Indigenous people are meant to give permission for major industrial activities, is not in play in Russia, right? It doesn't work in that way. Now, I don't want to single out only Russia. It doesn't work very well in most countries. And in part, it's because Indigenous people often don't have direct title to the land, right? Or they don't have full control over the mineral rights under the land. But it especially does not work in Russia. So we see, okay, you got oil and gas growing, you've got challenges for Indigenous people, they can't really use this language of rights, so what do they do? All right, so here are the questions that are going to inform the talk today. How do Indigenous people in the Russian Arctic interact with oil and gas companies? Can they influence what happens? And why do we hear them talk so much more about benefits rather than rights? What does it mean, benefits from the oil and gas sector? And then do these benefits empower Indigenous communities at the end of the day? Do they make them more sustainable? How can we think about them? I'm not going to be able to answer these questions, but we'll definitely think about them carefully. I'm going to tell you about 3 different research sites that I have been working in over the last 8 years or so, and they are circled here on the map. So the uppermost research site over that pink territory is the Nenets Autonomous Okrug. And the Nenets Autonomous Okrug is a republic, you can see, that sits there on the Barents Sea, that has about a little less than 10,000 individuals, Nenets, people who still practice reindeer herding. And then it has several tens of thousands more Nenets who don't engage in the traditional activity of reindeer herding. Just below and to the left, the circle is over the Komi Republic. That's the region that represents the ethnic Komi people, as well as some more of the Nenets population. And they also, about 15,000 people from this region also engage in reindeer herding. And then last but not least, way over 10 time zones on the Sea of Japan on the far right is the island of Sakhalin, which sits just north of Japan, which is home to several thousand people from different Indigenous groups, the Nivki, the Ulita, the Nanai, the Evenk, the Chukchi, and many of them are involved in fishing as well as other traditional activities. Okay, so I want to tell you about these 3 regions, and I want to tell you a little bit about these regions in the context of benefit sharing. So we know that the Soviet system collapsed, and these communities were left high and dry after settling themselves and organizing themselves in the Soviet model. And in their effort to survive, many of them turned not to the state, but to companies, to oil and gas corporations. And there's a reason, there's a logic to the fact that they did this. Because in the Soviet Union, there was no private economic activity. All economic activity was organized by the state. Every farm was state-owned, every enterprise was state-owned. The state-owned enterprises provided a lot of the goods and services and a lot of the infrastructure for the town. The school, the hospital, the daycare center, right? Housing for employees. So partly this is out of habit. But partly this is also because there is an emerging global regime for oil and gas companies that argue that these companies need to provide the benefits in some form to individuals who live on the territories where they extract resources, right? So this comes out of the International Labor Organization, it comes out of the Convention on Biodiversity, it comes out of a whole host of different organizations. So we're going to look at this idea of benefit sharing. How does it work? What does it mean exactly? Okay, this is a part where I'm going to skip pretty fast because I don't think people are as interested in this as I am. But there are different types of benefit sharing, right? So if we look at the bottom first, actually, we see this shareholder mode. This is what we have in Alaska in many cases. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act gave control of certain territory or certain mineral resources to the Alaskans themselves. They could either set up their own corporations or bring companies in, and they get direct dividends. But that is very, very rare around the world. More common is the top mode, paternalistic mode, which is kind of a little bit like a trinkets and beads mode that we think about. Sort of a gift giving, in-kind support, irregular, often because the state is pressuring the company to do so. Corporate social responsibility kicks in when companies are multinationals and they want to please their shareholders and their investors. And the partnership mode is a kind of more beefed up model where not only are resources transferred, but Indigenous peoples themselves actually get to participate in deciding where they should go. Okay, so what this means in a nutshell is that you can have two different kinds of equity. You can have distributional equity. How much do these communities get in terms of resources? And you also can have procedural equity. Do they get to participate in deciding what the resources are? This will all become clear as we look at these three quick examples. So let's look first at the Nenets Autonomous Okrug. And you can see here some traditional reindeer herding activity taking place in very close proximity to oil and gas installations, either a place where they're exploring or a place where electricity is being brought in. And in the Nenets Autonomous Okrug, we see something very interesting. We see relatively high resources transferred, but in a very paternalistic way. So what do I mean by that? In the Nenets Autonomous Okrug, there was an Indigenous non-governmental organization that had very good relations with the regional government after the collapse of the Soviet system. And they were able to get the government to commit to channeling a lot of oil and gas revenue to these communities, but the communities themselves could not decide how it was spent. The regional government didn't trust these communities with actual cash resources. They wanted to give in-kind benefits. So what does that mean? So here we see, this is a big ConocoPhillips oil and gas operation called the Ardalan Oil Installation that I visited while I was there. These are very self-contained units. They fly workers in and fly workers out on a 3-week rotating basis. They employ very few local people. They're like high-tech islands in the middle of what's a very traditional society. But ConocoPhillips found itself pressured by the government to do something for local people. And so they picked the community closest to them. This is the community of Horiver. And you can see these many, many different little wooden huts where people live, these kind of small dwelling places. And in the midst of it, this very bright yellow and red, multi-story, enormous building that dwarfs every other building in town. What is this? This is a school built by ConocoPhillips, right? They said, okay, well, we're willing to give a school And they brought in their own construction workers, their own technology. They brought in the modules from Europe and they snapped it together and they put it there. Now, this is a tremendous resource for the community. They're terrifically proud of the school. It's become a source of community engagement, but there was no budget for staffing the school and no budget for the ongoing maintenance of the school. So every year they have to revisit and sort of make requests. Now, this village was very successful, but many other villages that are less organized, have less powerful leadership, have not been successful. Another example is if you go to the capital of the Nenets Autonomous Okrug, Naryan-Mar, you can see these gleaming new buildings built by oil companies. There is an Ice Palace hockey arena. There's a new ethnological museum. And here there is the Arctica Cultural and Business Center, built with money from oil companies. So you have in the midst of sort of relative poverty and real struggles with kind of health and well-being, you have these gleaming symbols. And this is what you often get in a more paternalist approach. Nevertheless, a lot of people think, wow, this region of the Nenets Autonomous Okrug has done pretty well, all things considered, in gaining benefits from oil and gas companies, but they have very little say over what these benefits are. Here is a region that has been wildly unsuccessful, at least until recent years. This is the Republic of Komi. And the Republic of Komi has a group known as the Komi Ijemsi, and they identify themselves as Indigenous people. However, they were not put on the official list of Indigenous people when Russia's law was passed in 1999. Now, this happened to a number of groups. They weren't organized enough, they didn't have the ear of the government, for a variety of reasons, they were left off the list. So because they're not recognized as Indigenous, Luke Oil, which is the main oil company there, didn't feel like they ever needed to do anything for these people, even though many of them herd reindeer, they engage in hunting and fishing. And what the problem in the Republic of Komi is oil spills. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of oil spills from the 1990s to today, including a couple of enormous oil spills near the city of Usinsk. But the community struggled for more than a decade and got no recognition. So what did they decide to do? In this case, they decided to go outside of Russia. They went to the Arctic Council, they went to the UN, and they developed a joint project with Greenpeace International. And Greenpeace International came in with researchers and charted all of the oil spills in the Republic. In fact, in the year of 2014, they actually found more than 200 oil spills just in that year. And they helped the Komi Ijemsi people publicize a list of demands, right? Because they were suffering so much from these oil impacts. Some were compensation, some was environmental improvement. And finally, in 2015, after going to an Arctic Council meeting, Luke Oil decided to negotiate with this group for a benefit sharing agreement. So this is a very different model where eventually they were able to extract some benefits, right? And those benefits are a mix of in-kind and some transfer, some compensation for damages. Here's the last region. This is the gleaming best example in Russia. This is Sakhalin Island. And Sakhalin Island is a fascinating case because it has two massive oil and gas developments. They're called Sakhalin 1 and Sakhalin 2. And one is driven by Sakhalin Energy, that's Sakhalin 2, which was started in part by Shell and Gazprom. And the other is by a subsidiary of Exxon, right? And the interesting story is that when they began to build these massive offshore oil installations, there was a lot of disruption to the gray whale population and the salmon population. And Indigenous people were especially concerned about the salmon. They had fished salmon, sold salmon. It was a main livelihood practice. So once again, they united with environmentalists and they had a huge protest to no effect. And then Greenpeace, once again, said to them, you know who you should target? You should target the international banks that are lending money to these projects. And so they targeted the EBRD, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and the EBRD threatened to withhold an enormous loan to Sakhalin 2. This happened way back between 2006 and 2008. And they said, Sakhalin too, you better get your act together. We want to see you end these indigenous protests and meet their demands. And so what they did is they set up this elaborate system for channeling money to indigenous communities and businesses. And what's notable for Russia, and the reason this program has won many awards, is they allowed indigenous representatives to sit on the committee that decides how the money will be spent. Such a small thing, but so rare, actually so rare. So this became a model. In fact, it got written up. This is just one example of Sakhalin Energy. You know, they won all sorts of corporate social responsibility awards. And it really, you know, this is just one website of many. This is the UN Global Compact using Sakhalin Energy as an example of how to interact with indigenous people. Okay, so I've given you a lot of names, Nenets, Komi, Sakhalin, a lot of different examples. What does it all actually mean? So let's spend a minute thinking about what it means. Okay, before I get to these bullet points, we can think about the fact that benefit sharing seems more likely to occur, one, if you have the basic recognition as indigenous domestically, right? And we've seen US tribes, also Native Americans, struggle for recognition, right? And so this process goes on in Russia as well. If you have a sympathetic regional government, Russia is technically a federal country, although it's run in a very centralized way from the top, but there still are federal governments. So if you have sympathetic federal government, if you have a lease to your land, if you have a lease as an agricultural user, none of these indigenous groups I talked about today own land, right? In fact, it's very hard still in Russia to own land. There are a couple of regions where there are exceptional circumstances, but not in these. But if you have a lease, if you cooperate with environmentalists, now that's not always popular. Many indigenous people are very suspicious of environmentalists, and in some cases, rightly so. We've seen in Alaska cases where Native Alaskans and environmentalists have really come to blows over certain issues. But here we see, by and large, it works well. But then also, if you can reach outside of Russia to put pressure on shareholders, investors, or international financial institutions. Okay, benefit sharing. So I hope you get a picture that benefit sharing is consequential for communities. It can be given in ways that strengthen communities and ways that are less likely to strengthen communities, but it's still highly problematic in many ways. And I'll throw a few of these ideas out there that we could discuss. One, the oil and gas industry is going to continue to grow dramatically in the Russian Arctic in the coming decade. The plans are for it to expand enormously. In addition to which, they're going to be developing a series of ports along the Northern Sea route so that goods can be shipped directly from Northern Europe to China, Korea, Japan, now that the ice is receding. So there'll be huge infrastructural development associated with the Northern Sea route. In addition, many people charge that Russia is part of a process of militarizing the Russian Arctic. So there are new and refurbished military installations that also really dramatically change the face of the Arctic. Then we have the ongoing effects of climate change, which even alone are pretty significantly challenging for indigenous peoples. The top picture is a picture from the region of Yamal, which is right next to the Nenets Autonomous Okrug, where we see the melting of the permafrost allows for incredible erosion along the coastline. And the picture below, there have been some real challenges to reindeer herding in recent years. One of the challenges is the temperature fluctuates enough that instead of getting a snowpack that persists through the winter, you get snowfall, melt, ice, snowfall, melt, ice. Now, this is something we're very familiar with in Maine, right? This is like our #1 sort of winter weather. The problem with this in reindeer herding is reindeer cannot penetrate that icy layer to get to the lichen and sort of the bushes that they need to graze and forage on. So there've been huge reindeer die-offs in the Russian Arctic, in addition to some new diseases, right? And the main challenge is that the conditions for Russian indigenous people to advocate for themselves are very poor. For those of you who've been following the news, you see that the regime is becoming increasingly intolerant of dissent and protests. The kind of protests that I described to you were risky when they occurred back in 2005, 6, 7, 2010. They would be even more risky today. In addition to which, the main Russian Indigenous Association, the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, RAIPAN, which is Russia's permanent participant to the Arctic Council, has increasingly been taken over by sort of pro-government sympathetic representatives who many people charge don't advocate for Indigenous interests the way that they could. So in this unfavorable political context, where Indigenous rights seemed very difficult to sort of make a reality, to implement in practice, these communities turned instead to benefits. And this was a strategic decision, and in many ways, it's been very beneficial. Certainly in the short term, there have been some real improvements in quality of life in some villages and some places. Not all benefits are created equal. They vary in level, they vary in type, and they vary the degree to which they allow Indigenous peoples themselves to determine what to do, how to invest in their community for the future. We know that if benefits are given in a really paternalistic fashion, they can even further disempower these communities. But if they're given in a way where there can be some kind of Indigenous self-government, it could be a kind of empowering process. But the main challenge with benefit sharing, as I see it, and I think what matters more is how Russian activists see it and Russian Indigenous communities, but I've heard them voice this as well, is that it ties the long-term survival of these communities to the very industrial activity that is most threatening to the community. So in this sense, the oil and gas companies subsidize these communities in the short term, but in the long term, it is the release of carbon based on an oil and gas economy that accelerates climate change and that will ultimately make it impossible to pursue many of these traditional ways of life. So the worst case scenario is that benefit sharing is this palliative remedy. It doesn't adequately recognize Indigenous peoples as self-governing or self-determining. It eases the pain of the current moment, but can do very little to fend off future challenges. And in this sense, a lot of people in the region have said that re-engaging with the language of rights is the only way to allow Arctic Indigenous communities to better chart their own course in an uncertain future. Okay, that was a lot. I'm gonna get out of my presentation so I can see all your faces again. I hope that was brisk enough, but not too brisk. And I look forward to your comments and questions. If you want to unmute yourself or wave your hand, if I can see your face. Yeah, V has a question.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. That was really fascinating. And I was wondering if the development of the North Sea route, which will require, as I understand, a great deal of construction of infrastructure, which will be very expensive. And you were talking about the role of a big bank in helping promote conditions that would benefit the Indigenous peoples. Will the need to get financing and international cooperation to develop that shipping line, could that be leveraged somehow to help improve conditions for these various Indigenous peoples?
What a great question, V. It's so true that we're going to see this explosion of sort of construction in the Russian Arctic. However, there are a couple of things going on that make it a little bit unlikely that this can be used to advance Indigenous interests. One is that Russian projects in general, unless they need technology transfer, prefer to be self-financing. So what we saw in our research is that ConocoPhillips, Shell, Total, Equinor, which used to be Statoil, were a little bit more vulnerable to sort of Indigenous protest and demands because they were worried about their reputation globally. whereas Rosneft, Lukoil, Gazprom, a little bit less. Now, a lot of these are done with consortia, but the second thing that's challenging is the way that sanctions have played out. So after Russia illegally annexed Crimea, the Ukrainian territory of Crimea in 2014, there was a whole raft of sanctions placed on US actors, from companies to individuals. And many of those sanctions made it much harder to work with multinationals headquartered in the West, including oil and gas companies. And so what Russia has done is it has begun many of these projects working collaboratively with China. So Novatek, the big kind of LNG terminals, the liquefied natural gas terminals, things like that, are being done with Chinese support. And the Chinese government is much more resilient to the demands of environmentalists and local communities. So unfortunately, there was a kind of unintended consequence of sanctions that kind of made it more difficult for these groups to advocate. But we'll see. I mean, it's possible that we'll enter a period of rapprochement, of Arctic collaboration again, and then there might be more opportunities.
Thank you.
Great question. Other questions? Yeah, I see one here from Karen.
Yeah, I'm going to see if I can articulate this on the fly, so to speak. It seems like every variable, every factor is really going against them. I mean, there's very little light that I can see. You've talked, the few avenues you've talked about, it seems like it's getting worse. Including and especially that the reindeer are not being able to thrive. So even if they got more rights and or got more money or both, it's still not a sustainable culture. So the bottom line is, for me is, well, first of all, thank you for something that's even more depressing than QAnon.
Oh dear.
But does it make sense, just as happened in Alaska, where some indigenous communities have just said, we can't take this anymore, it's just not going to work, and they've moved? It doesn't, the rest of the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is a lot here to be concerned about. I mean, Northern cultures in general are going to be going through another enormous period of disruption. Now, these are cultures that have persisted for really thousands of years in various climatic conditions. Maybe changes in the past weren't quite as rapid. Now, one of the ways they coped with those challenges is through migration, right? And now that we have nation states and we're settled, and migration isn't as easily done. And groups are concerned, but they want to be able to chart their future path, themselves. They want to be able to make the decisions about how to navigate this. And in some ways, they're optimistic. So I sort of made Putin's regime sound rah, 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 so negative. If you're Alexei Navalny, it certainly is, no picnic today. But at the same time, there are little bright spots. So I'll give you a couple. So Vladimir Putin is very attached to the idea of Russia as a multinational country, a country of many different ethnic groups, because there are Tatars and there are Yakuts and there are Chuvash and Tuvans and Chechens and Ingush and all these other people. And so there has been some state support for the revitalization of language and culture and singing and folk art and costumes. They also would like these regions to be more self-sustaining. So there has been some investment in the back end of reindeer herding, processing, packaging, marketing, selling, the business end of reindeer herding. And so, I mean, kind of depending on how it goes, there will be adaptation, but I think most people in the region continue to be somewhat optimistic that if they just had the freedom to experiment and they just had sort of the resources to kind of innovate, that there will be ways. They won't be the exact same, but there will still be ways that they can practice their culture. Yeah, but it's going to be tough. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I teach a class called Politics of Climate Change. We are all going to go through a period of significant adaptation in the next 50 years. It's just these cultures are more aware, right? But yes, there are the canaries in the coal mine, certainly. Great question.
You have a question in the chat, Laura.
Oh yeah, please.
It says, in sparsely populated regions of the Russian Arctic, what role do indigenous peoples play in the politics of demonstrating Russian sovereignty in these areas? It says this is a big factor in Canada, but the geography is a lot different. The underlying question, in what ways does the Russian government need the indigenous people?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, there's this leftover idea from the Soviet period called the friendship of the peoples, in which all people are able to thrive under this economic and political system of the country. And Putin is still sort of attached to that idea. And, you know, but there are real sensitivities. So one of the sensitivities I would note, for example, is around the Sami people who straddle the border between Norway and Russia. And I think you have someone from the Thomas Nilsson from the Barents Observers coming to the Camden conference, and he'll be able to speak to this very clearly because they keep a really close eye on that. But there's tremendous sensitivity to the idea that claims to indigenous sovereignty and allowing the Russian Sami to participate in events with the Sami located in the other Scandinavian countries is like a risk to the country's sovereignty. You know, what's interesting is when I was in the Nenets Autonomous Okrug, actually in that village of Horiver, I stayed in the building that was the old school. And it was definitely good that they got rid of the old school because it had sort of subsided and kind of almost twisted sort of into like the swampy land around it. And we were allowed to stay there for a few days. And they still had the posters on the wall for the school children. You know, go into any elementary classroom in any country of the world and you'll see those alphabets and, you know, other things on the wall. And they had a song. It was a song about how much I love Russia. It wasn't a song I've ever seen before. It wasn't one of the traditional Russian songs. And it was about being proud to provide the oil that fueled the Russian economy. So I definitely think there's an effort by the state to kind of build an identity of partnership and a sense of like, you're involved in this important project. But yeah, I don't think it's quite the same as Canada. Certainly under the Soviet era, there was this idea of counting people, of naming people, of settling people, of having censuses, of writing down the language, of like organizing them. Like they couldn't be citizens unless they were organized and acknowledge themselves to be part of Russia. In that sense that it kind of solidified the presence of the Russian state on that territory. So it's a great question. I'd have to do a little more thinking about it. Yeah, Wayne has a question. Oh, Wayne, I think you're on mute still.
Yeah, can you give us a sense of indigenous leadership and community organization? How does that work? Is it very localized? Are they in communication a lot within a particular ethnic group, a region, or are they local? How tuned in when Greenpeace gives them some advice, who they give it to, and how do they decide to take it or not? And does that still happen?
That's a great question, and it really varies. And I also should say it's a very dynamic situation. I've kind of given you a snapshot, and so it changes over time. So in the Nenets Autonomous Okrug, the towns that we looked at, only one of them could be reached by road in the non-winter. The companies would build winter roads on ice, but the rest of the year you had to have a helicopter or a little plane they call a kukuruznik, like a little corn cob flying through the sky. Definitely not the smoothest flight you'll ever be on. And what we found in those places was something that really surprised us. We found that in villages where the collective farm had managed to survive the post-Soviet period and held the community together and still had a leadership and still had an elected council and still tried to keep people on the rolls and pay whatever minimum amount they could, we found in those regions, they were a little bit more organized and had greater institutional capacity to reach out and participate in these processes. In places where the collective farm had been completely just demolished, it just, kind of wore away into the swamp. People stopped going, it stopped paying, people emigrated out of the territory. Those villages really, really struggled because they didn't have the kind of leadership that you need to even engage in making a demand and following up and making a request. Now, in the case of the Komi and the Greenpeace, it was a city government. So it wasn't the region, it was a government in a small city in the territory most suffering from the oil spill, and an NGO. Now, an NGO that had been funded by grants from some Scandinavian philanthropies. So eventually, I think this NGO was declared a foreign agent. Many of the NGOs in the regions were declared foreign agents, but it was an NGO that provided that kind of touch point. So it varies from region to region, but certainly the economic dislocation of the post-Soviet period often was also a social dislocation. Yeah, but that's a really, really good question too.
Sounds like a parallel to the labor unions in the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
They survive, then there's real political participation.
Yeah, you need some structure to keep people together. Now, there is an interesting structure that's emerging, which is this really old tradition, which is being revived, which is called the Община, which is a traditional family and friendship network of reindeer herders who mutually support each other. They have migration routes that are near each other. They collectively process the meat, slaughter the reindeer. They support each other with equipment and things. And this is being revived as kind of almost like a small business, like a private small business. And in some communities, the Община are able to negotiate. Now, here's the trick. When the Общina negotiate, they tend to negotiate more for themselves. So it's not completely self-interested. Like, one of the things they negotiated for was to raise the height of the pipelines because the reindeer couldn't pass under. And there were so many parallel pipelines you had to coordinate across these companies, but they are often looking for things like snowmobiles or satellite phones, sort of things that they need. And there can be sometimes a division between the Община and the local mayor, for example. Any other questions? I've made it sound like doom and gloom, but I honestly have to say, and it is true that there's certain perennial challenges. There's challenges with communication. There's challenges with banking. There's challenges with the brain drain, with the young and most talented people going to the city, which is natural. If you were young and talented, there are challenges with alcoholism, right? And we see these in many, many communities, but there also is a really inspiring level of determination and a remarkable way in which people held on to what was culturally unique and specific, even in kind of the most difficult period. And it's just so admirable. And I would be really thrilled to see what these communities would do for themselves if given, the decision-making authority and the resources to back it up.
I have a question.
I have a question.
Oh, 2 questions.
Yeah, I noticed, I was in Norway, and I noticed in the northern part of the country that there was racism that existed between the Norwegian citizens and the Sami that lived in close proximity. That's just Norway. But I'm wondering if that same type of thing would exist in Russia between the Russian citizens living at whatever level that they do and seeing these benefits in housing and, you know, welfare. I hate to say welfare, but some of these benefits that are given to the indigenous people. And I'm wondering if you had noticed any of that in Russia, and if you did, is there any effort to try to reduce that or even hopefully eliminate it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, there is a tendency in some cases to infantilize indigenous peoples, treat them as naive. Sometimes if we would ask the government officials, so what do you think about indigenous self-empowerment? And they'd say, oh, that's crazy. You know, they're so naive, you know, they'll lose all the money, you know. But many of these regions are mixed population, indigenous Russian, because Russians were encouraged to settle, to populate, part of a Russification program that came around the time of Stalin and after. And I think for the most part, a lot of people work together, but I think it's hard sometimes when some villages are more successful at extracting benefits than others, and then there can be hard feelings. They got a school, we didn't get a school, because there's no real process behind it, right? So there's plenty of racism in Russian culture, and I'm sure there's racism in the North as well, and I have heard instances of it. But in most of the communities that I saw, there was by and large a spirit of collaboration. And there was somebody else who had so Pamela put a question here. Are there any other agricultural projects that show promise as the climate warms? You know, this is so interesting to me. I have seen these kind of the Arctic of the future with greenhouses and, you know, vegetable growing and, you know, the agricultural future of the Arctic. I didn't see it on the ground when I was there. People still traditionally, they gather berries, they fish, but I didn't see a really export opportunities. Now in Sakhalin, there's a possibility of an export with salmon and salmon roe. The challenge in that case is that industry became relatively criminalized. It's getting a little bit better, but in the 1990s, it became kind of interpenetrated with criminal networks. You couldn't get your salmon out of your kind of local region without working with some sort of middleman who did not have your best interests at heart for the most part. But I think, and there's a great artistic revival, a revival of not only traditional crafts, but then kind of modern interpretations of traditional art. So there's a real, that's something that a lot of people are excited about. Any other questions? Yeah, Karen had another question.
Yeah, I was interested in your research process. How did you engage with these communities?
Yeah, so we'd usually start in the capital and kind of meet sort of the local intelligentsia, the sociologists and political scientists and legal specialists who were there. We would meet any Indigenous Association representatives or NGOs, and then the people at the local university. And then we usually had a couple of criteria where we wanted to, you know, investigate different villages that were closer to or farther from active oil extraction. And then, of course, a lot of everything in Russia is personal ties. So then we had to find someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone and fly to these villages. When we got to the village, we usually tried to make a connection. And usually we had already made a connection to a local leader. So often it was the local mayor or sort of like community representative. And that person we asked to organize focus groups where we would just listen. And then we put it out there that we would love to interview or speak with anybody who would be willing. And in general, we got a lot of people to speak up. Often the former head of the kolkhoz, the person who was the head of the school, often the local elite were very interested in speaking. Sometimes it was a little bit harder. So, and we had done a human subject, so we had a full description of the project, and we only interviewed people if they gave us permission, and we anonymized everything. But sometimes it was just a matter of a simple thing, like there was a guy who won the Reindeer Herder of the Year award in one of the villages where we were, and he won this like sort of strange all-terrain vehicle that's a little bit like a tank. It's a little like a Bradley, whatever those things are, but it's white and it's for the Arctic. And he really wanted to take us for a ride. And then he wanted to talk and talk and talk. And another time the local school was having a performance, and they wanted us to go because it would be special for the school children to have people visiting from away. And then we introduced ourselves to the parents, and then people wanted to talk and talk and talk. But there often was like and that's why you have to spend time. You can't go for 1 day or 3 days. You know, ideally you go for weeks. And I was saying before we got on this call to the folks from the library, I feel very privileged to have done this work. I don't think I could do this work now. I think the sensitivities in the region around foreign espionage, corporate espionage, foreign intervention, around the idea that foreigners come and rile up Indigenous peoples, I think it would be virtually impossible for me to do this work today. So I feel very lucky. And the project is now wrapping up. We're at the end of it. My Russian colleagues might go on to do more in this area, but I think the moment for me, I have lots of other projects going on in Russia, but I think this area has become too sensitive to work in.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Sure, please.
I don't know if we have time, but I just want to quickly, because there was something you mentioned in the beginning of the talk about environmental issues. I may have it wrong, but it was something like Greenpeace or other organizations, when it comes to environmental issues and the native indigenous cultures, sometimes they disagree. So if I'm correct in that assessment of what you said or what I understood you to say, could you just clarify that and maybe give me some examples of where they would disagree on ways to handle specific environmental problems?
Yeah, so I had 2 examples in my talk where actually there was kind of a productive collaboration between environmentalists and Indigenous groups, which I think is a little bit rare. So in the Komi case, we saw Greenpeace did the research on the oil spills and paid for the delegation to go to international meetings, to the UN and to the Arctic Council. And in the Sakhalin case, we saw that in the interest of the gray whale and the salmon stock, the groups came together. Now, the way in which they sometimes can disagree is over their ultimate goals can be quite different. Like, of course, they both want the maintenance of the local natural environment, but the Indigenous people often feel as though they have a right, based on their traditional use over the course of centuries, to help manage and decide what to do with the kind of environment surrounding them. And we see this pretty starkly in Alaska. And I don't study Alaska, but this is, where we see in some cases, like in southern Alaska, there's been an alliance between environmentalists and Native Alaskans to preserve fishing stocks and to preserve some very kind of lucrative fishing areas. Whereas in northern Alaska, especially on the North Slope, there's enormous distrust between environmentalists and Native Alaskans, because the Native Alaskans in many cases own the mineral rights and are actively participating in the exploitation of the mineral rights and are using the dividends from that process, as they see fit for themselves and their community. And they don't want environmentalists to come up there and get in the way. Even in Russia, we've seen that, for example, on Sakhalin, there isn't such a dense engagement anymore. The Indigenous peoples don't have time to think about migratory birds for migratory birds' sake. Those aren't birds that necessarily are useful to them. And of course, they would like to see the birds survive, but people only have so much leisure time. People have only so much resources. They're not going to continue on certain environmental campaigns that don't directly affect them. And now that the partnership model is set up, the indigenous people can engage the oil company independently. They don't need the environmentalists to get in the middle. So you just see the alliance come together and then break apart. It doesn't have to be acrimonious. It's just not always really durable. So
Thank you.
and yeah, good question. When I was in the Russian Arctic, people would sometimes could tell I was a foreigner because of my eyeglasses or my shoes or Lord knows what. It was obvious. And they would often come up to me and say, Greenpeace, like, aha, I recognized you. And I would say, no, I'm not from Greenpeace. And they'd say, shh, like, don't tell anybody. And so people thought I was from Greenpeace no matter what I did, honestly.
Look, questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. There's so many parallels with Native Americans. Yeah, I do think there's a kind of recognition across countries. I mean, I think we got the Declaration of the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, and it withstood there as a symbol, and it didn't mean much in practice for a number of years. And I think we're starting to see some of the ideas and principles that came out of that convention being more rigorously applied and seeing more advocacy. I actually know a couple of Russian indigenous people who are more people who've lived in Moscow and who are highly educated and who go to the UN meetings and go to the Arctic Council meetings, who've actually visited Standing Rock and who talk a lot about a kind of international solidarity and the need for that. If the companies are going to be multinational, the indigenous movement needs to be multinational. So I think there's some interesting possibilities there.
A good one to wrap up with is in the chat. It asks if there's a way to stay in touch or follow your research and findings.
Well, I've got my webpage at my Bowdoin College webpage, which you can look at. I don't know if you want some of these, they're a little dry, but my publications are listed there. If you ever wrote to me individually, my email's there, just lhenry@bowdoin.edu. I can send you a copy. Some of them are, behind various scholarly paywalls, which is too bad. I'm happy to send you a copy. My own father can barely plow his way through my articles, so I don't necessarily expect interested bystanders. But keep your eye, the Camden conference is going to be amazing, but there's a lot going on around the Arctic in Maine. Bowdoin will be opening a new Center for Arctic Studies and a brand new Arctic Museum facility in about 2.5 years. We'll have a bunch of events around that. I'm going to try to bring some great speakers in. And so I think there'll be a lot more to look forward to in this topic.
So much, Laura. This was just fascinating.
Thank you for coming, everybody. What wonderful audience. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you.
Great.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. It was super informative. Thank you.
Yeah.
Kind of you.
Спасибо.
Спасибо большое.
Очень хорошо.
Oh, I appreciate that. Не за что. Oh, well, thank you very much, guys. I really don't get the opportunity to yak about my research too much, so I really appreciate all of you giving me the chance.